Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The calm before the storm. It was 4:30 a.m. when the alarm buzzed, cutting through the stillness of the early morning like a sharp reminder of the day ahead. Captain James Walker reached over, his hand finding the snooze button instinctively, silencing it before it could disturb the quiet of the room. His wife, Karen, was still asleep beside him, her breathing slow and steady. James had done this countless times before, this early morning ritual of an airline pilot, waking before dawn, the silent shuffle around the house, getting ready in the quiet of the pre-dawn hours. The wooden floor felt cold under his feet as he padded barefoot toward the bathroom, careful not to disturb the stillness of the moment. The dim light from the bathroom reflected off the mirror, casting shadows over his face. His reflection stared back at him, the face of a man who had spent 15 years in the cockpit, each line on his face earned through countless hours of responsibility, challenges, and a career that had, at times, felt like an uphill climb. James took his time getting ready, savoring the few moments of solitude before the chaos of the day began. He fastened the brass buttons on his uniform, each one catching the light, gleaming with quiet pride. They weren't just ornamental, each button was a symbol of the journey that had led him here. A reminder of the long hours spent working his way up through the ranks, the obstacles he had overcome to become one of the few black pilots in the industry. As a child, James had spent hours watching planes take off from O'Hare Airport, his small face pressed against the window of the family car. His father, a mechanic who had always worked on the ground, would smile at his son's fascination with the machines in the sky. "Maybe one day, you'll be up there, son," he'd say. But back then, James didn't see many pilots who looked like him. There was never anyone in the cockpit who resembled the young boy with big dreams, the boy who never gave up on believing that he, too, could belong to that world. The sound of the coffee maker gurgling downstairs signaled the start of his day. He could already smell the rich aroma filling the kitchen, a scent that had become a comforting constant in the years since he and Karen had settled into their home. A quick glance at the clock told him he had just enough time to double-check his flight bag. It was a ritual, like everything else. The list of things that couldn't be forgotten: iPad, check. Checklist, check. Spare reading glasses, check. And, tucked safely in the front pocket, the photo his daughter, Mia, had given him the year before. It was a picture of their family, taken on a trip to the beach. "Don't forget us when you're up there in the clouds, Daddy," she had said, and he had promised to carry it with him, always. The drive to the airport was peaceful, the streets still empty at this early hour. The only sounds were the hum of his car's engine and the soft tunes of old soul music on the radio, a playlist that reminded him of Sunday mornings spent at his grandmother's house. James hummed along, his mind running over the details of the day's flight. Chicago to Los Angeles, then a quick turnaround to Seattle. Routine stuff. At least, it was supposed to be. Every flight, however, had its own set of variables, its own potential for surprises. And James never treated any flight as a simple, routine task. As he pulled into the employee parking lot, he nodded at Tom, the security guard who had been working the gate since James had first started with the airline. "Morning, Captain," Tom said, offering a quick salute. They exchanged their usual small talk, jokes about the weather, the latest sports scores, and a chuckle about the Bears' recent loss. A quick beep of his ID badge, and James was through security, entering the terminal. It was always a bit of a surreal moment for him, walking through the terminal in uniform, seeing the mix of passengers heading toward their gates. Most of the time, people smiled or nodded respectfully, but there were always a few who would do a double take, their expressions frozen for a brief moment too long. James had long learned to read these moments like a weather pattern, a brief disturbance in the air that was quickly gone if you kept your course steady. The crew lounge was already buzzing with activity as he arrived. Flight attendants clustered around the coffee machine, exchanging stories about the latest passenger drama or the bizarre requests they'd gotten during the previous flight. Some pilots sat at computers, reviewing weather reports and flight plans. James grabbed a cup of coffee and took a seat to review his briefing for the day. "Morning, Captain Walker," Sarah called out, one of the senior flight attendants he had flown with many times. Sarah was the kind of person who made everyone feel welcome, who treated every crew member like family. It was a quality James appreciated. "Ready for another glamorous day in the friendly skies?" she asked with a smile, clearly in a good mood. James grinned back, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, trying to savor the warmth. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied. "How's the grandbaby doing?" "Growing like a weed," Sarah replied, pulling out her phone to show off a series of pictures of her granddaughter, a chubby-cheeked toddler in various aviation-themed onesies. James spent a few minutes admiring the pictures, a moment of lightness in an otherwise serious morning routine. After a few more pleasantries, James made his way to the operations desk, where Monica, the operations manager, was already waiting with the latest flight documents. "Clear skies all the way to LA," she said, handing him the paperwork. "Seattle's showing some potential for showers later in the day, but nothing too serious." James nodded, going over the details with methodical precision. Over the years, he had developed a keen sense for the details, things that others might miss. Minor shifts in wind patterns, slight maintenance notes, anything that could affect the flight. He didn't just follow the procedures, he understood the bigger picture. His job was about more than just flying, it was about keeping the lives of hundreds of passengers safe every time he climbed into the cockpit. As the crew began to gather, the pre-flight buzz filled the air. James walked through the terminal, headed toward the gate, his rolling bag trailing behind him. The sight of the passengers gathering at the gate always felt like the start of a new chapter. He could almost read them all, nervous flyers clutching their boarding passes too tightly, seasoned business travelers with their perfectly packed carry-ons, families managing the chaos of young children. Every flight felt like a small community coming together for a shared experience. At the gate, Jenny, the gate agent, greeted him warmly. "You're here early, Captain." "Full flight today," she said. James glanced at the growing crowd and nodded. "Anything special I should know about?" "Just the usual mix," Jenny replied. "A couple of unaccompanied minors, a few wheelchair assists, and one nervous first-time flyer who's asked me 3 times about turbulence already." James made a mental note to have the flight attendants keep an eye on the nervous passenger. Sometimes, just a word of reassurance from the cockpit could make all the difference. The pre-flight inspection was James's favorite part of the routine. It was a chance to connect with the aircraft, to develop a sense of the machine that would carry hundreds of lives safely through the sky. As he walked around the plane, running his hands along the smooth metal surface, checking every component with both sight and touch, he felt a deep sense of responsibility. Every engine, every control surface, every landing gear, told its own story. It wasn't just about ticking off boxes on a checklist. It was about understanding the aircraft, building a relationship with the machine that would keep everyone safe. By the time he finished the inspection, the rest of the crew had arrived. Flight attendants were preparing the galleys, making sure the emergency equipment was in place, their movements efficient and practiced. James exchanged greetings with each one, making mental notes of any concerns they raised. It was a routine that had become second nature, one that he relied on to ensure everything went smoothly. But even as he completed the final checks, James couldn't shake the sense that something was off. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken unease that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't until he reached the cockpit that he realized what it was, an unexpected change in personnel. Captain Barnes was filling in for another pilot, and though James had heard of him, he had never flown with him before. The aviation community wasn't large, and word got around about everyone eventually. The moment James stepped into the cockpit, he felt the tension settle over him like a weight. Barnes was older, in his early 60s, with gray hair and a weathered face that told the story of years spent in the cockpit. His eyes narrowed slightly as they took in James's uniform, lingering on the 3 stripes on his shoulders for a moment too long. "Barnes," he said, his voice carrying a hint of confusion that was impossible to ignore. "There must be some mistake. I was expecting Anderson today." James stayed calm, pulling out his iPad and showing him the updated roster. "Anderson called in sick." I'm his replacement." Barnes didn't respond right away, and James could feel the discomfort in the air as the seconds ticked by. This was going to be a very long flight. Crossing paths. The hum of the engines outside the cockpit seemed louder as Captain Barnes settled into the seat beside James. The tense silence that followed was palpable, like a storm waiting to break. James adjusted his headset and settled into the rhythm of the pre-flight checklist, but the feeling of unease lingered. He had flown with dozens of captains over the years, some older, some younger, some easygoing, others rigid in their ways. But something about Captain Barnes felt different. Barnes wasn't the kind of person who liked to break the ice. His eyes were locked on the flight instruments in front of him, his movements precise and mechanical, as though he was doing everything by rote. His posture was stiff, a certain distance in his demeanor that suggested he wasn't interested in small talk. James had seen it before, a kind of guarded professionalism that was born out of experience, but also, perhaps, a reluctance to embrace change. "Ready to go?" James asked, breaking the silence with his voice as calm as he could manage. Barnes didn't look up immediately. When he did, his eyes flickered over to James, briefly. "We're ready," he said flatly, as though it was a formality rather than a statement of fact. He then turned back to the instruments in front of him, pressing a few buttons and adjusting knobs with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. James didn't press further. Some pilots were like this, and after years of flying, he had learned to let their actions speak for them rather than waste time trying to read between the lines. James, on the other hand, was known for his calm demeanor and ability to build rapport with his crew, whether in the air or on the ground. It was a skill that had taken years to hone, a kind of emotional intelligence that had helped him through tense moments, from dealing with an emergency landing to offering reassurance to nervous passengers. But Barnes wasn't one to show much emotion. It was hard to tell if he was simply focused or if there was something deeper at play. The plane taxied toward the runway, the vibrations of the engines sending a subtle thrill through James. There was always something exhilarating about the moment just before takeoff, when the plane, held back by nothing but the runway and the will of the crew, would leap into the sky. And yet, today, the excitement felt muted, clouded by the awkwardness of flying with an unfamiliar captain. James wasn't used to this feeling. It was unsettling. As they began their takeoff roll, the engines roared louder, and James felt the familiar press of acceleration as the aircraft gathered speed. The runway lights blurred into streaks of white and orange in the early morning light, and with a soft shudder, the plane lifted off the ground, its nose rising into the sky. The world below began to shrink, and for a moment, the unease that had settled over him was forgotten in the rush of the ascent. But the silence between him and Barnes didn't break. The plane was now on autopilot, the cruising altitude steady, and the rest of the crew was busy with their own tasks. James could feel the pressure of the situation mounting. Flying with someone new was always a challenge, but it was even harder when that person seemed unwilling to engage. For the first time in his career, James felt a slight shift in the dynamic. He had always believed in the importance of clear, open communication in the cockpit, especially during a long-haul flight. It was essential to keep the flow of information constant and the atmosphere collaborative. The unspoken tension was a new and uncomfortable variable he didn't know how to adjust for. As the plane cruised through the clouds, he couldn't help but glance over at Barnes, who was engrossed in his flight plan, his brows furrowed in concentration. James wondered about him. He had heard rumors, old stories from other pilots about Barnes being one of those types who had been around for decades, but had a reputation for being a bit of a lone wolf. Someone who didn't exactly play well with others, particularly younger pilots. But there was something else about Barnes. Something beyond his cold exterior. James couldn't place it, but it was there, an air of something unresolved, a tension that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He had always been good at reading people, a skill honed through years of interacting with diverse personalities in high-stakes situations. But Barnes was a tough read. Breaking the silence, James decided to initiate a conversation. "I hear you've been flying for a long time, Captain Barnes. Must have seen a lot of changes in the industry over the years." Barnes didn't immediately respond. His fingers tapped the edge of the console before he finally spoke. "Too many," he said, his voice flat. "Back in my day, we did things differently. No iPads, no fancy autopilot systems, everything was manual. You had to know the airplane like the back of your hand." James nodded, trying to steer the conversation into safer waters. "I can imagine. Technology's changed a lot. But, it's made things more efficient. We have tools now that allow us to focus more on the bigger picture, the safety of the passengers, the weather patterns. It gives us a chance to be more proactive, rather than just reacting to things as they happen." Barnes' eyes flickered toward him, and for the first time, there was a hint of something, maybe interest, maybe curiosity, behind his stern gaze. "Proactive, huh?" he muttered, as if testing the idea. "I suppose you're right. But there's something to be said for the way we used to do it. Things weren't always as neat and clean as they are now." James wanted to press further, but something about Barnes' tone made him hesitate. There was a wariness, a deep-seated distrust of the present, that James could understand, but he knew now wasn't the time to push too hard. Flying was always a delicate dance of balance and control, not just with the aircraft, but with the personalities around him. The rest of the flight to Los Angeles passed without incident. The weather was clear, and the autopilot did most of the heavy lifting, leaving James with plenty of time to reflect on the man sitting next to him. Barnes had spent his career in the air, but he had clearly been changed by the years, perhaps by the frustrations of not seeing things evolve the way he thought they should, or by the isolation that often came with being a pioneer in a profession that wasn't always welcoming to newcomers, especially those who weren't like everyone else. As they approached Los Angeles, the late morning light glinted off the ocean, casting a golden hue over the city. James felt the rush of anticipation that always accompanied a landing, a reminder that every flight was a new chapter. As they prepared for their descent, he found himself glancing over at Barnes once more, wondering what his story truly was. What had shaped the man sitting beside him, and what had made him the way he was? "All right, Captain," James said, his tone more conversational now, "let's make this a smooth landing, yeah? We're in the clear, but I'd like to make sure we set down just right." Barnes looked over, giving him a tight, but knowing, nod. "Agreed. Let's finish this." The rest of the flight played out much like any other, but as they touched down on the runway at LAX, the weight of the strange, unspoken partnership between them didn't disappear. It was just one more challenge, one more obstacle to navigate. As they taxied to the gate, James sat back in his seat, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. The clouds parted, and for the first time all flight, the sky seemed to open up with endless possibilities. Maybe, just maybe, it would take a little more time for him and Barnes to find common ground. But that was the beauty of the sky, there was always a new day ahead, a new chance to learn, to adapt, and to rise above the tension. As they parked at the gate and the passengers began to disembark, James gave Barnes a quick glance. "See you on the next leg?" he asked, his voice lighter now. Barnes simply nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was a slight shift in his posture, an imperceptible sign of acknowledgement. It was a small moment, but for James, it was enough. Every flight was a journey, and sometimes, the hardest part wasn't the altitude or the weather. It was the people you crossed paths with along the way. Uneasy alliances. The days following the flight to Los Angeles were a blur of routine, a series of takeoffs, landings, and long stretches of cruising at high altitudes. James had flown with dozens of different pilots in his career, but there was something about Captain Barnes that kept gnawing at him. He couldn't quite figure out what it was, but he found himself thinking about Barnes during the quiet moments between flights. It wasn't just the captain's cold professionalism. It was more than that. Something in the way Barnes carried himself, the tension in his movements, the brief, almost imperceptible glances that passed between them during the quieter moments of the flight, it made James feel like he was dealing with a man who had been through a great deal and wasn't quite ready to share his story. He had seen it before in other people, worn-out soldiers, battle-hardened survivors, people who had seen enough to know the world was more complicated than it seemed. It was an invisible wall, and though Barnes wasn't rude or overtly hostile, there was no mistaking the distance he kept from others. The next time they were scheduled to fly together, James tried something different. Instead of waiting for Barnes to speak, he decided to be the one to break the silence first. They were in the cockpit again, preparing for another flight, this time a longer haul to Chicago. James was familiar with the route, and the plane had already been checked and double-checked by the ground crew. It was as smooth as any other takeoff should be. Still, the sense of foreboding lingered, thick in the air between them. James initiated the conversation by asking a simple question, a harmless one he'd learned from years of flying with different crews. "How's your family, Captain?" Barnes stiffened slightly, though his eyes never left the console in front of him. There was a momentary pause before he answered, and when he did, his voice was clipped. "They're fine," he replied, a standard answer. "Busy?" James pressed a little further, sensing this was the kind of question that could go either way. "Busy with what?" Barnes' jaw clenched, but after a beat, he seemed to decide to indulge him, albeit reluctantly. "My wife runs a small business. Keeps her occupied. And my daughter's at university now. She wants to be a lawyer." "Must be nice," James said, his tone casual. "A daughter following her dreams." Barnes gave a short nod, though there was a slight tightness in his face that suggested the topic was not one he was particularly comfortable with. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice softer now, but still distant. "She's making a name for herself." James knew better than to push any further, especially when it came to personal subjects. He had learned over the years that sometimes, a little silence was the best answer. But as the plane lifted off, climbing steadily into the cloud-dotted sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was being held back. Something that went beyond professional boundaries. As they reached cruising altitude, James decided to let the conversation die down for a while. He turned his attention to the various instruments in front of him, checking and rechecking as they settled into the long stretch of flight. But his mind kept wandering back to Captain Barnes, and the uneasy feeling that had begun to take root. Was it simply that Barnes was a man who didn't like to share? Or was there something deeper, something about his past, his choices, that made him more isolated than others? It wasn't long before their uneasy truce was broken once more, but this time by a sudden jolt. The plane shuddered, and for a moment, everything went still. It was the kind of turbulence James had felt countless times before, strong, but nothing to panic over. Still, the unsettling sensation of the plane jolting unexpectedly brought the atmosphere in the cockpit back to life. James didn't hesitate. His fingers flew to the controls, steadying the aircraft, and his voice cut through the tension. "Light turbulence, Captain. We'll be through it in a second." Barnes, who had been staring out the side window, suddenly snapped to attention. His face, which had previously been set in its usual neutral expression, hardened slightly, but there was a flash of something more, something primal, in his eyes. "Stay on course," Barnes barked, his voice suddenly sharp and authoritative. "I've got it." James was taken aback, but he didn't argue. Barnes had been flying much longer than he had, and there was a sense of experience in his voice that demanded respect. He relinquished control of the plane for a moment, though his fingers hovered over the secondary controls, ready to act if needed. For the next few minutes, the two pilots worked in harmony, despite the undercurrent of tension. The turbulence was mild, a mere inconvenience, and it passed quickly. The autopilot clicked back into action as the plane returned to smoother air. James couldn't help but notice the shift in Barnes' demeanor after the event. The captain was no longer distant but had a renewed focus. He seemed almost alive again, as though the turbulence had pulled something from him, something buried deep inside. It was as if the storm outside had mirrored the storm within him. Barnes didn't speak for a while after the turbulence subsided, but James could tell that something had changed. The captain was different now, not warmer, but more alert, more engaged. It was as though the flight had cracked open something in him, a crack in the armor that James had been struggling to understand. After a while, Barnes spoke again, his voice quieter this time, as though contemplating his words carefully. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I didn't always want to be a pilot. I thought I was going to be a mechanic, fixing planes, not flying them. But then, I don't know. Something about being in the sky, controlling it, it just felt right." James raised an eyebrow, surprised by the unexpected shift. "I can relate. Sometimes, it's not about where you start, but where you end up." Barnes nodded, though his gaze was distant again, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. "That's true. But the truth is, I never really got to live that life. The one I thought I wanted. I took to the skies, sure, but I always felt like something was missing. Something I never had the chance to figure out." James paused, sensing the vulnerability in Barnes' words, a vulnerability that he hadn't expected from the man. "Maybe it's not too late," he said softly, though unsure whether Barnes would even consider the idea. "Maybe you can still find that missing piece." Barnes gave him a long look, as though weighing the idea, and then, with a small, almost imperceptible smile, he said, "Maybe. But who knows? The sky has a way of keeping things in perspective." The conversation lulled again, but there was a subtle shift in the air, a deeper understanding forming between them. The unease that had lingered between the two pilots was still there, but now it felt like something they could work through together. Flying wasn't just about planes and technology, it was about the people you flew with, the connections you made, and the moments when you allowed yourself to be more than just your job. Maybe, just maybe, they would find that balance. As the flight to Chicago neared its final descent, the clouds parted, and the sprawling city skyline came into view, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. James glanced over at Barnes, who was no longer the enigma he once seemed to be. There was still distance, yes, but a little more understanding too. The flight wasn't over yet, but their journey together had just begun. The calm after the storm. The descent into Chicago was one of those rare, perfect landings, the kind pilots live for. The wind was calm, the sky clear, and the visibility, despite the setting sun, was impeccable. The city below stretched out like a web of lights, its grid a comforting reminder of the world they were heading toward. James sat back in his seat, his eyes on the horizon as the plane banked gently into its final approach. The air in the cockpit was thick with quiet understanding, the tension between him and Captain Barnes having softened to something more amicable, if still cautious. They had spent hours together in the skies, and though neither man had openly acknowledged the changes in their dynamic, they both knew something had shifted. It was a delicate balance, like the very flight they were piloting, one that could tip either way in an instant. "So, Chicago," James said, breaking the silence. "You ever been here before?" Barnes glanced over at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "A few times. Not my favorite city, but it gets the job done." James chuckled softly. "Fair enough. I've never spent much time here either, but there's something about the skyline that feels welcoming, you know?" Barnes didn't answer right away, his eyes narrowing slightly as he focused on the instruments in front of him. There was still an air of caution about him, but it wasn't the cold barrier it had been before. It was more of a guard, one that wasn't meant to keep others out so much as to protect whatever was still vulnerable inside. "I guess," Barnes said eventually, his tone light, but thoughtful. "I used to think the city was a reflection of the people living in it, rough around the edges, always working, always fighting for something. But I've seen enough of the world to know that's a narrow view. There's more to it, more to people, than just what you see at first." James let the comment hang in the air, letting Barnes have the space to say what he needed to without pushing him further. They both knew that a story like Barnes wouldn't come easily, but the willingness to talk, even in brief, indirect ways, was a step forward. It wasn't much, but it was something. The approach into O'Hare was smooth, and as the plane's wheels touched down on the runway, there was a satisfying thrum of motion beneath them, the solid, steady reminder that they had completed another journey together. The tension that had once gripped James when flying with Barnes had eased, replaced now with a subtle camaraderie. They were no longer strangers, no longer simply pilots sharing a cockpit. They had become, in a way, companions on this strange, unpredictable ride that life had given them. As the plane taxied toward the gate, James turned to Barnes one last time before they debriefed. "You did good today," he said, the words genuine. "Real smooth." Barnes gave a curt nod, his usual reserve returning, but there was a flicker of appreciation in his eyes. "You weren't too bad yourself, kid." They both knew it wasn't just about flying anymore. It was about trust. About surviving the turbulence, both in the skies and in life, and finding a way to stay on course. Whatever lay ahead for either of them, they would face it as pilots, as men who had shared the same altitude and the same struggles, if only for a brief moment. As they disembarked from the aircraft and walked toward the terminal, the cold wind of Chicago greeted them, but it didn't feel so harsh. It was just another part of the world, another place where the journey continued. And whatever lay on the other side of the horizon, whether it was another flight, another storm, or something entirely different, James was ready for it. And maybe, just maybe, Captain Barnes was too.